Up in arms. We are kind of in a global pandemic. Some people forgot about that, I guess. And we have civil unrest in a lot of these cities, including what's taking place in Kenosha, Portland. It's craziness, right? So the guy we have with us on the line right now, very dangerous job he has, and I give him a lot of credit for it. So he's an independent video journalist. He's been doing this for a very long time. We'll talk to him about that. He was the eyewitness to what took place in this Kenosha shooting with this 17-year-old. He also recently just saw what took place in the last week with Rand Paul outside the RNC. He is Brendan Gutenschwager, and he joins us right now on the line. Brendan, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Thank you for having me.
No, thanks a lot, Brendan.
Brendan, a lot of people would say, are you crazy? What are you doing? I mean, these are very dangerous situations you're putting yourself into, and I appreciate what you do. Don't get me wrong. But a lot of people be like, what the hell is this guy thinking? You're in these situations, in these protests. It's very dangerous. How do you respond to that?
I'd say this is work that needs to be done. It is very dangerous work, but if it wasn't for the brave individuals, not just me, but others there on the front lines, the photographers, the videographers, a lot of these things would never get out to the public, and they wouldn't know the full story, or at least as much of the story as we do now.
Right.
So it's critical work.
Yeah. Yeah, no question. I agree. Certainly what you're doing is dangerous, but I think I speak for a lot of people when I say certainly we appreciate what you do. All right, so Brendan, let's start with the news. Let's start with what's taken place over the last week in Kenosha. So you were there. You saw this kid Rittenhouse. You saw what happened. It's my understanding you didn't see the first shooting, but you saw the second shooting. Is that correct? And what can you tell us about what you saw?
Yes. So basically I had heard the gunshots of the first shooting, and that was about a block away from me. I had then run towards it. At that time, I saw a man down on the ground and a crowd swarming around. Kyle Rittenhouse then started to separate from that group, was being chased. People were saying, go get him. He just shot somebody. And that's when he started to run down the street, which is where you see my video come in there.
So you're saying you heard the first shots ring out, but you didn't see it. The narrative that I have heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but the narrative that I heard is people were chasing him because they were trying to disarm him because of that first shooting. Do you have any knowledge of that, and do you think that's why they were chasing him down?
I believe that's why they were chasing him down. That led to the second shooting, yeah. Now, what led to the first shooting where I had heard the shots ring out and then had run over there, that I am not sure about.
Gotcha.
But yes, that is accurate for that.
So you've seen this stuff before, sadly, but what is going through your mind when you're in the middle of this whole thing? You see this 17-year-old running with a gun, and I understand at the time you don't know exactly what's going on, and then you see more shots fired, and then this kid puts up his hands, and police officers just drive by him. I mean, what do you make of that?
It was probably the most shocking scene I've ever seen in my life. It really just blew my mind. I couldn't even process it as it was happening. It's one of those things where you just keep filming and you're watching it. And I remember I kept thinking, like, the police they're going to hop out of these vehicles or they're going to tear gas them or something, right?
Right.
And the one out of all the possible scenarios, I thought maybe they would run up and arrest him. Maybe they would just shoot at his feet with some of those pepper balls to try to get him away.
Right.
The one scenario I did not imagine was the one that ended up happening, which was that he would just basically put up his hand, walk right to those police cars, and then just walk right on past them.
Isn't that wild? And I hear people in the background saying, arrest him, he's the shooter, arrest him. And I'm thinking to myself, this might be a tough question for you to answer. And I know it's purely speculation, but this is part of the reason why I think a lot of minorities in this country are upset. And the question is this: what if this kid was black? Do you think that would have gone down the same way? I don't think it would have. I mean, what do you say?
I don't think it would have.
Yeah.
And part of it, too, is that he had already interacted with police prior to this earlier in the night. So it could have also been like a recognizance thing that they, as opposed to just some random individual that this is the first time they're seeing him versus later in the night. But yeah, no, I don't think it would have gone down the same way.
So so we agree on that, and I think that's a reasonable opinion. So let's take this a step further now. I mean, what I've said from the beginning is this: I don't know all the facts, neither do you, but you know more than me. Clearly, you were there. I don't know whether this is self-defense or not, but here's what I do know, and you could tell me if you agree or not, Brendan. He shouldn't have been there. First of all, he shouldn't have had that gun. We know that was illegal. He shouldn't have been there. I mean, it'd be one thing if his father owned a business there and he was in front of the business, But that's not the case. My opinion is the mother was irresponsible. He was irresponsible. He shouldn't have been there. And now look at the situation we're in. Would you agree with that premise, whether it was self-defense or not?
I will say that, yeah, to be crossing state lines to come defend property that isn't yours, nor is it like a close family member or friends, I don't understand why there's a high schooler over there at these protests at night at, 1 a.m. or the exact time that incident happened. That's just very, very atypical. And I've covered a lot of these protests. You don't typically see people that age out that late, certainly not openly with firearms.
Sure.
That's just,
absolutely
really, really not really appropriate for these situations.
Yep, absolutely. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Brendan Gutenschwager. He is an independent video journalist. He was there in Kenosha. Before we move on to Rand Paul, I want to ask you a little bit about Portland. I know you weren't there, but again, it's the same opinion that I have. It's not the argument that these Trump caravans couldn't be there, right? We know they have the First Amendment right; they're allowed to be there. But now we're learning that the police department over there did everything they could to try to stop them from coming. And my opinion is the same thing. You shouldn't have been there because I don't think you're doing any good. If anything, you're going to make the situation worse. If you want to have a Trump rally, do it anywhere you want to, but that's probably the last place you should have done it, certainly at that time. And now we have another person dead, and I don't know what the circumstances are with that death. Don't know if it was self-defense. Don't know if it was murder. But again, here's what I do know. They were agitators, just like the BLM. Some of those protesters are agitators as well. There's no question. But you're only going there. It's only going to make the matters worse. You've covered a lot of these protests, Brendan. Would you agree with that premise?
Yeah, so actually, and I had just been in Portland right before Kenosha, so I'm not even entirely shocked to see this level of escalation because just the week prior, there was a massive standoff with a group of Trump supporters / Back the Blues / just kind of the more conservative / right-wing groups versus the Black Lives Matter, the Antifa, the socialist groups. And they had gotten in quite a few clashes where they were physically brawling, macing each other, pepper spraying each other. And that was just on Saturday, August 22nd, so it's about a week ago.
Wow.
And so the problem is that you have these groups that come to the same location. That was all in downtown Portland as well, basically the same spot that this new Portland shooting happened. And it's just such a tough line to walk because on one hand, you're right, like the First Amendment, every one of these groups has the right to be out there if they're peacefully protesting. But the tensions are so high in this country right now that one of those groups sees members of the other groups, and there's immediately that hatred, there's immediately that animosity, and it just creates these problems. So, I mean, would separating the groups and putting them in different locations help? Yes, but at the same time, how do you do that and still respect people's First Amendment rights? That's an extremely tough call.
It is tough. I just wish they wouldn't do it. So I'm going to ask you, I don't know if this is a political question or not, but I'm asking you this question because this is what you do for a living. You've been involved in so many of these protests. You've been there as an independent video journalist. So the president over the weekend retweets this right-wing fringe group that shows up in these caravans and calls them great patriots. He retweets them. And the underlying theme here is that he goes after these BLM protesters, puts up that stuff, and then supports his people that were also agitators.
Brian, he's not going after protesters. He's going after looters and rioters.
So, Brendan, would you agree that that's certainly not going to make the situation any better when the president takes one side and commends one side of the agitators and not the other?
Honestly, I don't know that it affects the situation too much at this point because people, for the most part, know where Trump stands on these things, and people know the things that Trump will call attention to, the things he won't. I honestly, at this point, I think it's just one of many voices, even though it is the President of the United States, and that people are so fired up in and of themselves that, it really isn't going to affect it much one way or the other.
Sadly, you're probably right, even though I disagree with the president's behavior. So let's move on now, Brendan, and let's move on to Rand Paul. National story that broke over the weekend. I thought it was over. And again, my personal opinion, it might be different than yours. You were there. I was not. I saw the video. You were there. And it appeared to me that, you had a bunch of, a dozen, maybe 20 or 30 idiots that were part of the BLM movement that were yelling at Rand Paul. I saw a portion of the video that shows a police officer being shoved. Luckily, nobody was seriously hurt, far I understand, even though Rand Paul said that he was attacked, and he made it like he was physically attacked, like it was one of his neighbors, for lack of a better term or joke. But with that being said, can you tell us what exactly you saw there, and is my description of what took place fairly accurate?
Somewhat. So I would say, yeah, he came out. He had a police detail, and there was like local Washington D.C. police, like the Metropolitan Police Department, and they were out with him. To be honest, I'm not sure why he was walking from the White House over to his hotel as opposed to taking some kind of transportation. But that's whatever's going on internally there. But yeah, so when I came up on the scene, he was already surrounded by, first off, the police. That's like a small circle around him, and then a wider circle around that of the crowd of the Black Lives Matter protesters. The vast majority of them, their main thing was chanting Breonna Taylor. They, were trying to, because he is the Kentucky senator, so the Breonna Taylor case had happened there. That was a big priority for them to kind of confront him on that issue. And for the most part, I'll be honest, he looked scared. He really did look scared, and I don't say that to try to put a man down or anything, but just looking in his eyes, and then seeing the crowd around him, I definitely think there was some fear there. Now, things weren't violent, and I'm going to be honest. I've seen so many of these protests where people start throwing water bottles and then projectiles and sometimes even fireworks, and there was none of that with this. So they did at least, it was a lot of yelling, a lot of crowding around. The closest they got, once they started to move Rand Paul along and try to get him closer to his hotel, those crowds, they stayed closed in, and the police were outnumbered there. There were definitely more Black Lives Matter protesters that were surrounding that group than there were police officers present at that scene. So the police knew they weren't going to be, actively trying to push the crowd away. It was one of those things where it's just surround Rand Paul and try to get him to his hotel and then, figure things out after that. And so as they tried to move him along, somebody did, I think one of the officers had said, back up to one of the protesters, and then the protester said in response, you back up, pushed into the bicycle, which then caused that officer to stumble back, which then stumbled back into Rand Paul. You can see them kind of stumble in the video that I had shot, and then Rand Paul kind of grabs the officer from behind, almost like to pull him closer to him as protection. And they just kind of move forward. So, in terms of anything physical on Rand Paul himself, I did not witness anything like that. I do know that because of the little pushing and shoving that was going on there, they did stumble, and that was definitely a tense moment because in that moment, I did wonder if the crowd would decide enough's enough, we're closing in, and we're just going to swarm these officers. I wasn't
so to me,
sure
Brendan, and to me, Brendan, that would have been absolutely an attack, and I'm so glad that did not happen. Even though I can't stand Rand Paul, and I understand why people don't like him, I don't condone yelling at people and that sort of behavior. But with that being said, would you label it the way Rand Paul was labeling it, as he was attacked? Because I don't see it that way.
Yeah, I did see that in heated morning interviews the morning after, saying he was attacked by a mob. I think that was the quote.
Yeah.
I wouldn't describe it that way. I would say he was surrounded by angry protesters.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely accurate.
Absolutely.
But because I've seen officers and political officials actually attacked at these things, and that wasn't the equivalent. If people wanted to attack, they probably would have, from further back in the group, been throwing projectiles, water bottles, things like that they've been doing at so many of these protests already, and none of that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, like Rand Paul's neighbor attacked him. Okay, we can all agree on that. That was an attack.
That was a real attack.
So when you say
that being said, the fact that those protesters or the mob, I guess, was yelling at Breonna Taylor's name to Rand Paul, who actually wrote the bill, the senator in the Kentucky who actually wrote the bill, eliminated the no-knock warrant, to me shows how ignorant they are.
Rand Paul's... okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Brandon.
The issue that a lot of the protests... It's interesting you bring that up. A lot of the protesters recognized that and said the issue is that it wasn't a no-knock call that resulted in the Breonna Taylor case, that the officers had actually knocked in that case. So the bill was, in her name, but it wasn't actually relevant to her specific case, and it applies to federal, not to state and local.
That's a good point. That's exactly what I was just going to say. So, Brendan, I want to ask you this: you've said that you've seen politicians actually attacked before. You've been doing this for tell us how many years, and what are some of the craziest attacks per se that you've seen over the course of your career?
So we've been doing all of this general protest rally event coverage for about 5 years now. 2015 is where I started to begin that. It really is. This year, though, has been the escalation of a lot of that. In Portland, I was there. There was that one night where Mayor Ted Wheeler had come to stand with the protesters, basically, And it was a very awkward moment because the protesters didn't seem to really want him there, and then even the police weren't really super thrilled that he was now siding with the protesters who were at times agitating police. And so I remember with him, he was getting pushed and shoved in the crowd there, and then eventually he got tear gassed a couple times and decided to leave. But yeah, so I mean, things like that. Other than that, not too many of the politicians themselves, because a lot of times they don't get too into those crowds. That's why the Rand Paul situation was interesting, because he was right there, you know, on the streets, being surrounded by these people. So, you know, generally, I would say probably Portland's been some of the craziest in that regard.
Gotcha.
But others, yeah.
Gotcha. Go ahead, JD.
Have you ever been tear gassed, or have you ever been in a situation where you actually thought that your life was in danger?
Have I been tear gassed? I ought to keep a running counter, probably at least 30 times at this point. Yeah. I've been tear gassed over and over.
That does not sound.
These things.
That does not sound like it's a lot of fun. I have to ask you about Donald Trump in Kenosha on Tuesday. So my understanding is, I know you're in Chicago right now. You're going to be headed back to Kenosha tomorrow.
Yep.
I mean, it's incredible to me. You're going back into this war zone at times without much protection. What do you expect is going to happen tomorrow? Do you have any idea where the president is going? Where is he speaking? And do you think this is going to do any good? Because a lot of people are saying it's going to do more harm than good. At least the mayor is saying that.
Yeah, well, we haven't gotten word, at least I haven't yet, on specific locations. They said he was going to survey damage from the riots. So my guess is that he was going to go down. There's this one business district. There's two main streets that were really, really burned out in the riots, with a lot of businesses smashed or burned to the ground. So my guess is he's going to go to one of those areas, probably also the county courthouse there. Yeah, I don't know exactly what his plans are, because it's already a very, very volatile situation. They're very, very hostile, especially if you now, after what happened last Tuesday, and you have these competing groups that are already tense on the streets, and that's without any Donald Trump presence. My guess is it's definitely not going to be a unifying moment. It's not going to be something that, causes everybody to come together, lay down their arms, and, have a nice, peaceful night. Sure. I'm concerned, having seen what happened over in D.C., I believe it was June 1st of this year, when Donald Trump had wanted to go to that church across the street from the White House, and there were protesters around it.
Right.
And so in order to get him over there, they had to tear gas the people ahead of time to get them off the scene to then bring Donald Trump over.
Sure.
As soon as he announced that he was going to Kenosha, my first thought was, is there going to be another one of those scenes where he needs to get somewhere, and so the Secret Service or whomever decides, hey, we've got to clear these protesters out?
That's a very good question. Boy, I hope that doesn't happen. I want to ask you this, because you're the type, you've been to all these protests. You know exactly what's going on, so I have to ask you this. It is my personal opinion that the majority of those in the Black Lives Matter movement are not nonviolent, not agitators. Yes, there are agitators out there. Yes, there are people that are lighting things on fire. There are agitators out there. But I believe the majority, and that could be 60%, 55%, I don't know. All I know, at least what I believe, is, Brendan, and you would know more than I, but the majority of these people that are protesting, the millions throughout the country, are not violent, and they're not bad people. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, the vast majority of these protests are peaceful. And one thing that's important to note, too, especially just take a city like Portland. So much of the attention starts at 8 p.m. Portland time. But what people don't realize is that during the daytime, during the afternoon, there's family protests. There's like families marching for Black Lives with little kids, 5 to 10 years old, that are in these marches in the streets at 3 in the afternoon. That's also Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is not just the intense standoffs with police and people throwing projectiles. There are definitely a vast majority that are using peaceful means, peacefully protesting, aren't even out at some of these more tense scenes that you're seeing with the chaos and the tear gas and the pepper spray and all that. So that's my take on that, because I've witnessed so many of these, and you're right, they are mostly peaceful.
Have you had any in-depth conversations with any of those that are part of Antifa or BLM? And I'm not talking about during the day, but at night, as far as, why are they there, or what do they actually believe in?
I have had conversations with them, yeah. They're angry about the police presence in their cities. They certainly don't like it when the federal agents are sent in. That's a huge, huge agitation for them. They are trying to bring it more community-based, and that goes even just with the policing. Even the police departments, a lot of them are opposed to those and would rather see those defunded, have the funds go to some kind of community policing. I haven't really gotten a clear picture from any of them on exactly what that would look like, but just in general, more funding in the community,
Sure.
I suppose, is the idea. And so, yeah, definitely police agitation is really high on their list. And in general, just a federal government trying to step in and quell protests. That's something that tends to agitate them a lot, that they
Sure.
feel they're out there exercising First Amendment rights. And so when officers are saying, oh, now there's a curfew, now you can't protest past this hour, now we're going to start issuing citations, it just ends up agitating even more.
I mean, why are they violent? I mean, in my opinion, and again, you said the smaller minority, which we agree on, and you would know better than anybody. In my personal opinion, they're hurting the BLM movement and they're giving Republicans ammo. Would you agree with that?
I guess, yeah, in the sense that those headlines, when you see a Black Lives Matter protester attacking an officer or throwing fireworks at the federal agents at the courthouse in Portland, that definitely doesn't help the image overall. And you're right, it would give some it would give additional arguments to the Republicans and to the right on, hey, these protests are turning violent. They're not using the proper means, even if that is just a minority of the overall protest movement that's doing that.
Yeah. Well, Brendan, we want to help you out, man, because I tell you, I know I don't speak for myself when I say I really appreciate what you do. It's very difficult and dangerous work that you're doing as an independent video journalist anywhere, like no different than a journalist who goes out there to Afghanistan or Iraq during a war. I mean, in my personal opinion, what you're doing is just as dangerous. It's really awful. So you need some help. Let's be honest here. You need some funds, and I don't blame you for wanting to get some help financially. So we have about a minute and a half left here. Can you give out some information, because we want to help you out best we can? How can people find you, and how do people donate some money to what you're doing?
Absolutely, and I appreciate that.
Sure, of course.
My Twitter is the main source of me releasing my content, as well as just in general getting messages out, and that's BG on the scene. It's just all, one handle there, and that's my handle across all platforms: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, BG on the scene. And I can receive, support is needed, because a lot of this, I send myself out to these places on my own expense and just try to cover it and whatnot, and you kind of just hope that ultimately you can finance it one way or another. So if anybody would like to support, I do have Venmo, Cash App, and PayPal. They're all the exact same username, BG on the scene, spelled the exact same way. And yeah, any help, any support is extremely appreciated, extremely, because a lot of these times, I mean, I've literally been robbed covering these things.
Oh my God.
Windows smashed. I've had all sorts of incidents, tires popped.
Oh boy.
And so expenses come up left and right, so any support people can give, BG on the scene, I really, really appreciate. And
we will put that up. We will put that up on our social media and try to help you out any way we can. I got to say this: you're a very talented guy. You should be able to be picked up by a real, big time news organization as a reporter, because I think you do a hell of a job. You do a hell of a job, and you're so good at it. And whether it's Fox News, CNN, I don't care what network, somebody needs to hire you. And I would, for one, watch you, because I think you do a great job. And I'll tell you what, I wish you luck tomorrow. I know you're going back to Kenosha, very dangerous and volatile situation, but hopefully we'll be able to talk to you again at some point down the road, Brendan. And I really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's great talking with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
you
Brendan.
as well. Really, really good dude. And